My name is Christopher Hayes. I'm a professor of New Testament at the Biblical Seminary of Colombia in Medellin. I'm also a member of the St. Augustine Seminar, the team of scholars that has helped prepare the Bible studies and the theological reflections for Lambeth 2020. What's the second chapter of 1 Peter all about? It continues the momentum of chapter 1, at the end of which Peter encourages the believers to live lives marked by mutual love for one another. Thus, the first verses of 1 Peter chapter 2 warn against the sorts of sins that would tear apart the mutual love and the unity of the community of believers. It warns against malice and guile and slander and envy. But before continuing with a whole series of teachings about how believers are supposed to conduct themselves, Peter pauses. And in verses 4 to 10, Peter will offer an explanation of the identity of the church in relation to Christ. Peter will describe the members of the church as living stones built into Christ, who is their cornerstone. And it's an image of people being a living temple representing God in the world. He calls us a holy people. He calls us a royal priesthood. And we are called to offer sacrifices, specifically manifesting God's love and God's character to the world. With that account of the identity of the people of God, Peter then renews his teaching on how the church should live in the world. He'll talk about 3 different topics in succession, 2 in chapter 2 and then 1 at the beginning of chapter 3. The first topic will be how Christians are to live in relation to the Gentiles and specifically the state. The second topic will be how Christian slaves should live in relation to their masters. And then in the third chapter, Peter will talk about the relationships between Christian wives and husbands. These exhortations, telling the Christians to honor the emperor, while fearing God above all, telling Christian slaves not to respond with sin when they're treated unjustly, do also remind us of the vulnerability and the marginalization in which most Christians in the first century found themselves. It's an important encouragement to the many Christians around the world who are living in situations of persecution and marginalization and vulnerability, a reminder that their state of affairs is not new, and that ultimately the God that has always been shepherding the church will continue to shepherd them. So how is the second chapter of Peter relevant to the church today? Its relevance begins in the fact that it gives us a crystal clear understanding of our fundamental identity as believers, that we are a royal priesthood, that we are representatives of God in the world, and yet we do that as pilgrims in this world and not as people who belong in this world. And the ramifications of that identity are myriad, both in the ways that it tells us not to behave and the ways that it tells us that we ought to behave. It tells us how we need to live in relationship to one another and what sorts of relationships or behaviors we need to avoid the sort of backbiting and calumny and slander and envy and hostilities that would destroy the unity of our communion. And perhaps especially important, the second chapter of Peter teaches us about how to live in a world where there is unjust suffering. The letter teaches us that suffering injustice is not an excuse for returning evil for evil. And it gives us a vision of, in many ways, filling up the sufferings of Christ, of imitating Jesus' unjust suffering as a mechanism of bringing about transformation in the world. As I spent the last several months reflecting on the second chapter of Peter, the phrase that has most impacted me is the line in the 11th verse that describes us as aliens and exiles in the world. This is important for me both insofar as it helps clarify my own sense of identity. You see, I live in South America, but I'm from the US, and so I'm always a foreigner there. and sometimes I miss my own home country. And yet I realize that in either place that I currently find myself, I'm only a sojourner, that I'm ultimately a citizen of a heavenly kingdom. And all the work that I do now is an investment in that world that is to come. But it's also a reminder to me, this description of us as aliens and exiles in the world, that we need to be welcoming to people who are, in the present age, refugees and migrants. In the current migratory crisis of the 21st century, perhaps one of the most important perspectives Christians can have as they confront how best to love their traveling neighbors is a reminder that their belonging and all the things that they have in their present countries are temporary, and that we, along with our migrant brothers and sisters, are ultimately migrating together homeward to the kingdom of heaven. As I've worked leading a project that looks at forced migration in Colombia, responding both to the migratory crisis of forced displacement within Colombia, and also now seeking to be sensitive to the fact that there are 1.2 million Venezuelans that have come into Colombia. This verse has been a source of inspiration and courage and consolation. A lot of times people will give pushback to the idea that they have an obligation to help somebody who's a foreigner, somebody who they perceived has invaded their space. And yet I think that this verse, this concept of being aliens and exiles in the world, has given me, has galvanized my sense of commitment to the importance of loving those who are visibly aliens and exiles in our communities, reminding us that our identity and that our privileges and our benefits are temporary, that they're gifts to us that need to be stewarded in common, insofar as we're all part of the kingdom of heaven together. The description of Christians as aliens and exiles in the world, as people who are, as it were, migrating towards the kingdom of heaven, is very much coherent with the way in which Jesus' own ministry on the earth unfolded. Jesus was a forced migrant as a child because of violence. He had to flee to Egypt. And his life is also a life marked by migration, both voluntary and involuntary, as on various occasions he had to seek refuge in other parts of the Middle East, of the Holy Land, when persecution took, for example, his cousin from him. But he also was a voluntary migrant, traveling voluntarily to different parts of the Holy Land in order to share the gospel, in order to announce and inaugurate the kingdom of God. Jesus, therefore, when he calls his people to give welcome to receive the stranger, as in Matthew 25 with the parable of the sheep and the goats judgment, he tells his disciples that in welcoming the stranger, they welcome him, because in his own life, he was so often a stranger. And so today we have an opportunity, knowing that we ourselves are strangers in this world, to welcome Christ in other people who come to us as strangers and yet are paradoxically and simultaneously sisters and brothers. I think the awareness of being a pilgrim people, called to give welcome to other pilgrim people, should galvanize our sense of Christian mission, should excite us and encourage us, and ultimately help fix our eyes on the fact that we are in the process of migrating homeward. So to those of you participating in Lambeth 2020, those of you who lead our communion, would encourage you to lay hold of the messages of 1 Peter chapter 2, to take to heart the exhortations to ensure that the ways that we talk about each other lead to unity, lead to mutual upbuilding, not to give in to the sorts of divisive speech that could damage our communion. I would encourage you to teach one another about what it means to fear God and honor the emperor in your different world contexts. I'd encourage you to share your experiences from different parts of the Anglican communion about what it means to be faithful to God, whether in situations of abundance or in situations of persecution. At the end of Lambeth 2020, may it be the case that the wider Anglican communion, and indeed all the world, would behold your good works, your love for one another, and would they therefore glorify God?